Just like that, week 1 of the fantasy season has concluded and week 2 is already here. So you know exactly what we're going to do. We're going to go through every single matchup, talk about every single wide receiver, and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting in week 2 of the fantasy season. All right, let's kick the video off with Thursday Night Football. We will have the Washington Commanders traveling to face the Green Bay Packers. Certainly an interesting matchup when it comes to the wide receiver position. And let's start with Scary Terry and the Washington Commanders side of things. Bad performance in week 1 for Terry McLaurin, fresh off of that contract and missing essentially the entirety of the offseason. 4.7 fantasy points, 4 targets, 2 catches, 27 receiving yards. Had him as a start last week, and ultimately I'm not really panicked on Terry McLaurin. Could have taken a little bit of time to get going here with him missing the offseason, but also week 1, it wasn't really a game where the Commanders needed to throw the football a lot. The game script wasn't necessarily in Terry McLaurin's favor, but it also wasn't necessarily like a high-scoring day for the Commanders at the same time. So I guess you could argue that Terry McLaurin should have seen more volume in this game. Nonetheless, once again, I'm not going to panic here. It's not a great matchup against the Packers here in week 2. This defense did look very good in week 1, but ultimately, I still think he's a fine start. But keep in mind, it is a short week. Thursday Night Football, not always my favorite, especially for a player coming off of a slow week 1, going up against a good defense. Then Deebo Samuel did pull through with 22.6 fantasy points. We had him as a flex option last week. 10 targets, 7 catches, 77 receiving yards. Once again, the game script ended up favoring Deebo, heavily utilized in this matchup. And once again, don't love the defensive matchup this week. Don't love the short week, but Deebo Samuel is going to remain a viable flex option here in week 2. And I do expect the Commanders to have a need to throw the football more here in week 2. So that is good for both of the wide receivers here. Noah Brown, Jalen Lane, anybody else on this roster we don't even need to talk about, not fantasy relevant at this point in the season. The Packers, always a good one, right? You never know what you're going to get out of this wide receiver room on a week-to-week basis. Week 1 at home against the Lions, this offense showed up. I will say this wasn't really a game where the Packers needed to throw the football a ton, but Jayden Reed came out on top in terms of this wide receiver room, 13.5 fantasy points. We had him as a good flex option last week, but we knew he held some risk coming off of the injury. He didn't do a whole lot, 5 targets, 3 catches, 45 receiving yards, but he did find the end zone against a soft Lions secondary. So, the Commanders defense looked pretty good in week 1, but they were facing the Giants, so I don't know what to make of that. This is a good enough matchup that I think that Jayden Reed is still a strong flex option this week. And the main thing with Jayden Reed is that he has the ability to get into the end zone, probably more so than any other wide receiver on this team. But I do think it's going to be a very up and down season if you own any shares of any Packers wide receiver. And let's talk about the rookie Matthew Golden, who had just 2 targets, 2 catches, 16 receiving yards, and 3.6 total fantasy points. We had him as a potential flex option last week and definitely did not come through. Once again, the game script here, we only saw 22 passing attempts out of Jordan Love. Josh Jacobs had 19 total rushing attempts. The game script just didn't really benefit the wide receivers for the most part as the game started to progress. So I still think that there's a large role in line for Matthew Golden because we didn't get a lot of production out of any other wide receivers here. So he's definitely, not a player you need to drop or anything, but at this point, until we kind of see it on a regular basis, he's going to be a sit for me. Romeo Doubs, I thought maybe could have a nice opportunity if Jayden Reed didn't play, but then Jayden Reed played. And Doubs had 2 catches for 68 receiving yards off of 4 targets, 8.8 fantasy points. Dontavian Wicks, 5 fantasy points, 2 targets, 2 catches, 30 receiving yards, So, both those guys are going to be sits, and the Packers wide receiver room just continues to be a nightmare from a fantasy perspective. So we'll see how things shake out on Thursday night. And looking at early lines on Underdog for week 2, I'm going to take a chance on Deebo Samuel this week as he was heavily involved in week 1 with 10 targets and 7 catches for 77 receiving yards. He currently is sitting at 46.5 receiving yards on Underdog. I'm going to take the over on Underdog for that receiving line in week 2. And don't forget, all new users on Underdog are going to get a free pick 'em when you guys sign up using promo code THECATCH. So take that free pick 'em, ride with me, take the over on Debo in week 2 or any other line that you like for Thursday night football as week 2 starts to get here. And when both of those lines hit, you'll automatically double your cash entry when you use that free pick 'em that you got using promo code THECATCH. And Underdog has a new offer for all new users who sign up using promo code THECATCH. As soon as you play through $5 on Underdog, you're automatically going to receive $50 in bonus cash to use towards week 2's action. And when you sign up, you're going to receive a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 as long as you guys use promo code THECATCH. That link is down below. All right, moving into Sunday's action, we have the Giants traveling to face the Cowboys. Let's start with the Giants side of things. Russell Wilson, definitely not impressive in week 1, and we're getting some talk now about maybe Jackson Dart or Jameis Winston starting in week 2. I think ultimately it'll probably still be Russell Wilson. I think it's too early to make a change, but also not surprised that that talk is already happening because that's just how things tend to go. And Russell Wilson was 17 of 37 for 168 passing yards. Fortunately, Malik Neighbors still got you 12.1 fantasy points. It's a good matchup this week against the Cowboys, who barely allowed any fantasy points last week to wide receivers. Against the Eagles, A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith, but I think that had more to do with game plan and stuff. So I still like this matchup for Neighbors. He's still got to be in your starting lineups if you own him, and you should feel good if you do own him, regardless of what the talk is about the quarterback position. Randall Robinson, the other player here, I think is definitely startable in the flex if you're desperate, kind of a low-end flex option, but seemed like Russell Wilson liked targeting Robinson in this matchup. He had the second most targets of any player, the wide receiver position for the Giants. So I think he kind of lives in that 10, 11 point area when it comes to PPR points and could be an option if you're absolutely desperate. He says it's just 23% rostered. Darius Slayton, Jalen Hyatt, nobody else we really need to talk about. So kind of a low-end flex and Robinson and Neighbors, don't panic. He will be fine and was good enough in week 1. Moving to the Cowboys, CeeDee Lamb still going to be a strong start here in week 2. I mean, I know he had the drops and everything, but I mean, what are we really freaking out about here? He had 18 fantasy points, 13 targets, 7 catches, 110 receiving yards. And outside of the drops, in the red zone, he did have a target that he was held on it, right? And we got some PI on that one. So could have been an even bigger day. We all know for CeeDee Lamb, and still a solid day. Let's not overreact here. And a good matchup this week against the Giants ultimately. George Pickens is going to live in that flex area. There's going to be a boom or bust here. There's going to be a risk reward. Week 1, it didn't really work out, but he also had that big play, down the field where he was held on, had some PI. Could have had a much bigger day overall and at least gave you a solid fantasy outing. So 4 targets, 3 catches, 30 receiving yards. Did see a lot of Javonte Williams, but I still believe that it's going to be a pass-first team in 2025. So still think Pickens is flexible. It just depends on who you have on your roster. Anybody else here, going to be a sit for me in week 2. Be the Seahawks traveling to face the Steelers. This should be an interesting matchup based on how things went in week 1. Pretty underwhelming when it came to the Seahawks offense ultimately in week 1. But the player who was not underwhelming was Jackson Smith-Njigba. 19.4 fantasy points on the day. 13 targets, 9 catches, 124 receiving yards. Sam Darnold threw for 150 yards in this game. 124 of those yards went to Jackson Smith-Njigba. He is the heartbeat of this passing attack. No doubt about it, okay? Jackson Smith-Njigba, until further notice, is a must-start player. And the Steelers secondary, although they made some plays against the Jets, they did not look good whatsoever. They gave up the second most fantasy points only to the Ravens at the time I'm recording this in week 1. So, maybe that was part of the week 1 effect or something, but ultimately this is a good matchup for Jackson Smith-Njigba, and we know the volume will be there. Cooper Kupp looked like old man dust, 3 targets, 2 catches, 15 receiving yards. He's going to be a sit. Torrey Horton had no targets. So right now it's looking like literally Jackson Smith-Njigba and nobody else take the volume. He's a solid start in week 2, to say the least. Then we move on to the Steelers. DK Metcalf got you through 12.3 PPR points, 7 targets, 4 catches, 83 receiving yards on the day. Ultimately, when we look at the Seahawks defense in that matchup against the Niners in week 1, they were okay, kind of middle of the pack, but they did play not so great against the true wide receiver 1 for the Niners, who was Ricky Pearsall, and with Kittle banged up in that game and Juwan Jennings banged up in this game, or last week's game, sorry, they didn't really have anything to worry about, and Ricky Pearsall still had over 100 receiving yards. So Metcalf, I think, is a solid start. I don't think he has an insane amount of upside, even with the success the Steelers had passing the football in week 1. But, that's what Metcalf's going to be. Solid start when he scores, an upside start, but going to be hard to predict when he does score. Calvin Austin, I talked a lot about in the offseason as a player who could come in here and be the true wide receiver 2 for the Steelers. And he did that on Sunday, right? 17 PPR points, 6 targets, 4 catches, 70 receiving yards, and a tutty. But most importantly, gained some trust from Aaron Rodgers throughout the course of this game. So Calvin Austin probably out there on the waivers. We talked about him in the waiver wire video, sitting at 7% roster. Listen, there might be some ups and downs here. It was a great week for the Steelers in week 1. Still early in the season. I think Calvin Austin, a strong pickup for you guys who could be flexible. Nobody else that we really need to discuss in this offense. Everybody else will be a sit here in week 2. Moving along, we will have the Rams traveling to face the Titans. And, Puka Nacua, eye patch, no eye patch, bleeding face, no bleeding face, stitches, it doesn't matter what kind of injury this guy has. He is going to give it his all every single week and be Matthew Stafford's favorite target when he's on the field. 11 targets, 10 catches, 130 receiving yards, 23.1 PPR points in week 1. He is a player that's an absolute must start no matter what on a week-to-week basis, as long as he is healthy. And maybe as long as Matthew Stafford's healthy, but Matthew Stafford's healthy right now, right? Devontae Adams had 8 targets, just 4 catches, 51 receiving yards in this matchup, 9.1 total PPR points, but I still think he's in the flex area. Solid start. I do think that this Titans defense is okay based on how things went in week 1. They allowed the 3rd fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, not including those Monday Night Football matchups, and that front 7 looked pretty good. And I do kind of think, basically this same thing happened with the Rams defense. This game could get a little bit defensive, but Adams, I still think, has to be in the flex area. He just kind of holds risk, and maybe we're looking for, upside weeks when he does score, and that might be hard to predict. Now, I had Calvin Ridley of the Titans as a sit last week. Did not like the matchup against Pat Surtain and company in week 1. And I don't really like this matchup against the Rams in week 2. I think he's more startable this week than he was last week, but the Rams still top 7 against the wide receiver position in week 1. And that defensive line looked really, really good. And now they're facing Cam Ward in his 2nd ever NFL start. Cam Ward, wasn't awful last week, didn't throw any interceptions. He did have a lost fumble, but he only threw for 112 total passing yards. And I just don't think it's necessarily going to get much better here in week 2. So I think Ridley is a very risky start. And like I said last week, I didn't like him last week. I don't think I like him this week. I wanted to like him this week, but yeah, I don't think I'm going to be in that boat. He's going to be a sit for me. LK Manor, Tyler Lockett, whoever else is left here for these same exact reasons, also be a sit here in week 2. Next up, we have the Bills traveling to face the Jets. And boy, oh boy, we may have a breakout season upon us for sophomore wide receiver Keon Coleman. Now, one thing I talked a lot about going into week 1 was, on paper, the Ravens defense and the secondary looks good. If we were in a game of Madden or something, but this defense was really, really poor in terms of fantasy points allowed to wide receivers last year. And I told you guys, I'm not really afraid of the Ravens defense. And the highest scoring game of the week, right? And they gave up a lot of fantasy points across the board to Bills wide receivers. Then we move into week 2, and the Jets are not that far behind, giving up the 24th most fantasy points in week 1 to opposing wide receivers. Now, will this game be as high scoring as that week 1 Bills-Ravens matchup? I don't know, but one of the other highest scoring games of week 1 was the Steelers and Jets, so it could be very likely. And another defense I talked about throughout the course of week 1 that some people thought was a good defense that I was not worried about whatsoever was the Jets. So I think that ultimately we look at the two wide receivers who saw the most volume in week one between Khalil Shakir and Keon Coleman. I think that they are both very solid starts here in week two. And Josh Palmer in this discussion as well. I mean, he did technically tie Khalil Shakir for 9 targets, so I guess he's right there in the mix as well. But I mean, Keon Coleman on Monster Day, 11 targets, 8 receptions, 112 receiving yards, a touchdown, had an additional red zone target as well, 25.2 total fantasy points. Shakir, 12.4 fantasy points. Josh Palmer, 11.1 fantasy points. But I think ultimately, Keon Coleman's kind of like the upside play that you want to keep close eyes on right now. Josh Allen showed a lot of trust to him in week one and definitely in big situations. He made some big plays. Khalil Shakir, kind of like the safe floor type player. Palmer, I just worry, like, was some of the volume added because of the game script? Like, he had the big catch towards the end of the game, for example. So he's a player to keep an eye on. I mean, he sits at 32% rostered, and if Keon Coleman's sitting out there in your league at 76% rostered, he needs to be picked up. But yeah, I worry a little bit here, but I think ultimately the most encouraging thing was we did see a heavy passing attack, although it may have been influenced by game script. Last year we saw a lot more games where it's just like Josh Allen, James Cook, and not a lot of utilization of the wide receivers. So if you own Keon Coleman, I would feel good, and I think Khalil Shakir, maybe even if he's closer to like the flex area, is still a good start here in week one. Then we look at the Jets. All of my love for Garrett Wilson all off season long felt very validated in week one. I know it's very early here, but Justin Fields can throw the football at times. 22.5 fantasy points for Garrett Wilson in week one. 9 targets, 7 catches, 95 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. Very solid stat line. It gets the Bills this week. Bottom 5 against wide receivers in week one, and that matchup we just talked about, right? So Garrett Wilson has to be a strong start. And after this matchup, he's going to get the Dolphins and then the Cowboys. Tough matchup in week 6 against Pat Surtain and the Broncos, but then he's going to get the Panthers and the Bengals. This is a player who you absolutely want in your starting lineup over the next couple of weeks. Next up, we got an interesting one. The Patriots traveling to face the Dolphins. Let's start with the Patriots side of things. We saw a decent passing attack, at least a high volume passing attack out of the Patriots. Drake May was 30 of 46 with a passing touchdown, 287 passing yards. Stephon Diggs had 11.7 fantasy points, 7 targets, 6 catches, 57 receiving yards on the day. I think he will live in that flex area. This is a very good matchup against the Miami Dolphins, who might have the worst team in the entire NFL, but what we do know, a very bad defense, a defense that I talked about last week, because they ranked high last year in terms of fantasy points allowed, especially against wide receivers, but his defense does not scare me at all, even if Daniel Jones is starting quarterback, right? But, ultimately it's a good matchup for Diggs. He's got to be in the flex area, but the interesting wide receiver here is Kayshon Boutte, who had 16.3 fantasy points in week one, 8 targets, 6 catches, 103 total receiving yards. And I think you pronounced his last name Booty. I'm sorry. Listen, I just want to be hesitant with this one because this wide receiver core for the Patriots is a bit convoluted. Like, we did see Demario Douglas score a touchdown in this game. Kyle Williams had 1 catch. So, I don't know. Mac Hollins had 2 targets and a catch. Booty is the player here who ultimately has the most upside. He's only 4% rostered, but I just feel like we've been here before with the Patriots wide receiver room. And then I just worry about actually putting him in my starting lineup this early in the season. Good pickup. The upside is there. The volume was there last week. Good matchup this week. The only reason I have him sitting in the flex area is because of the matchup. Like, if this was basically almost any other matchup, I don't think I'd really be considering him at all. But if you're absolutely desperate, like you drafted Jalen Waddle and Chris Olave and Jawan Jennings as your flex options, sure, maybe just based on matchup, but I just worry, it's very, very early, guys. I don't want to read too much into week one, but the 16.3 fantasy points in week one, definitely very promising if we're going to see this much of a passing volume out of the Patriots on a regular basis. Let's talk about the Dolphins. Tyreek Hill, I got him as a flex, the lowest end flex that you could possibly have is where I have Tyreek Hill. Like, once again, I don't want to completely overreact to week one, but the Dolphins offense looked absolutely abysmal in that loss to the Colts. And like, the Colts have a decent defense on paper is one thing I don't think a lot of people realize. And the Dolphins were on the road, but I mean, Tua, 14 of 23, 2 picks, a lost fumble. Like, I just don't feel great here. Hill is still going to be flexible at best. And I'll just leave it at that. Still led the team in targets at the end of the day. I don't know what that really means at this point in the season, though. Jalen Waddle, I just have a sit. I had him as a flex last week, and ultimately, like, I haven't been a Jalen Waddle guy going into the year. He got a little bit banged up in this game, was able to come back and play. Not currently on the injury report at the time of recording this, but yeah, if I'm lowering Hill to like just the low end flex area, Waddle's just a sit for me. I fear it's a wasted year for Jalen Waddle if you did draft him. But once again, we're only in week 2. It's very, very early. Anybody else here? Malik Washington, Nick Westbrook-Akine, we don't even need to talk about. Let's just move on to the next matchup. Next up, we have the Jags traveling to face the Bengals. And let's start with the Jags side of things because this is certainly an interesting wide receiver room as we progress into week 2. The Bengals defense, still not good, but they still finished kind of middle of the pack against wide receivers in week 1. Judy had an okay day. Said Tillman found the end zone, all of that. So I think this is a good enough matchup on the road here for the Jags, but the passing offense did not look in stride whatsoever in week 1. I mean, Travis Etienne was, the best fantasy player for the Jags in week 1. T-Law was 19 to 31, 178 passing yards, a passing touchdown, and an interception. And Brian Thomas Jr. definitely suffered from that. He maybe got you through around 9 fantasy points because he did have a rushing touchdown. But you take that away, he only had 1 catch, 7 targets, 1 catch in this game. Does not have me feeling great. And then on the flip side here, Travis Hunter had 8 total targets in this game, 6 catches, and the interception. If Trevor Lawrence had thrown a decent ball, it probably would have been a large touchdown to Travis Hunter, and then probably having a very different discussion about Hunter here early in week 2, and maybe a less harsh discussion on Trevor Lawrence. But ultimately, I just am going to kind of have Travis Hunter in the flex area. Brian Thomas still as a start. I don't want to overreact in any way, shape, or form too much to week 1. I think that's where those guys are probably going to live for the next couple of weeks, unless we see a complete downfall of Brian Thomas, which week 1 almost felt that way, but once again, let's not overreact. It was a really weird game between the Panthers and Jags. We had the weather delay. I don't know. I felt like that game was going to be so much better for fantasy, and it was almost essentially a disaster. So it's going to leave those guys where they are. Jamar Chase, week 1, I don't know what happens to the Bengals, but on the road against Cleveland, we only saw 4.6 fantasy points out of Jamar Chase. Just don't forget, last year he had 12.2 fantasy points in a week 1 loss to the Patriots, then 7.5 fantasy points in week 2 against the Chiefs, another loss. And then he finished the year as the wide receiver 1. So I wouldn't panic too much on Jamar Chase. You go back to 2023, 9.1 fantasy points in week 1, 8.1 in week 2. So maybe this trend doesn't really support week 2, but come on. If you own Jamar Chase, you just have to start him. Don't overthink it. Same thing goes for T. Higgins, and this is a strong matchup against the Jags this week. I know the Jags looked okay, to say the least, against the Panthers, but I think that this is a very different matchup here against the Bengals in week 2. So no need to panic on Jamar Chase or T. Higgins. If you own them, there's still viable start options here in week 2. Next up, we have the Niners traveling to face the Saints, and Ricky Pearsall, one of my favorite starts overall in week 1. I mean, he had a very good game, just 4 catches off of 7 targets, but turned it into 108 receiving yards. But I mean, ultimately only 14.8 fantasy points. And I do have this slight concern, George Kittle's banged up. Now Jawan Jennings is banged up. Literally, and I talked about this all week long. There's nobody else at wide receiver here. And Sky Moore had 0 targets. Russell Gage had 0 targets in this game. MVS, the only other option here, also had 0 targets. It is Ricky Pearsall, and that is it. And then I guess Jake Tongues at the tight end position. It's these guys and Christian McCaffrey, who did have 10 targets and 9 catches in this game. as the receiving options, as long as Kittle and Jennings are out. And I mean, Jennings might play this week. We don't know at the time of recording this, but he's currently set to undergo that MRI on his shoulder. So either way, I don't feel great. But, I do worry some weeks for Ricky Pearsall because there's, this defensive pressure in terms of the secondary. All they got to do is line up on Ricky Pearsall and then I guess worry about CMC, at least in the short term. But this is a good matchup against a poor Saints defense who just allowed a great fantasy day to Marvin Harrison Jr. And you look at that team, outside of Trey McBride, there's no other options in terms of the passing game. So I think Ricky Pearsall will be fine this week, and I think that he's a solid start overall. Let's not panic too much. He gets pretty good strength of schedule in next coming weeks, facing the Cardinals and Jaguars. Tough matchup against the Rams, but then the Bucks and the Falcons. So I still feel good about Ricky Pearsall until further notice. Then we look at the Saints. Chris Olave banged up. Surprise, surprise, but he did come through with 12.4 fantasy points, 13 targets, 7 catches, 54 receiving yards. This Niners defense looked pretty good in week 1, but ultimately they still gave up a huge game to Jackson Smith and Jigba. So if Olave's healthy, I think he's a solid flex. Spencer Rattler wasn't great, but he certainly wasn't as bad as advertised. So I think Olave is startable. Then Rashid Shaheed, I still think is close to a flex. If Olave doesn't play, I'm okay maybe flexing Shaheed if you truly don't have better options. He finished the day with 9.3 fantasy points. So ultimately, I just don't really want too much of this offense in my starting lineup outside of Alvin Kamara, but if you have to roll with Chris Olave, I still think he is very startable in the flex if he's healthy here in week 2. Next up, we have the Browns traveling to face the Ravens. Let's start with the Browns side of things with Jerry Jeudy, 11.6 fantasy points in week 1, 8 targets, 5 catches, 66 receiving yards. Still think that ultimately Jeudy is a solid start, probably closer to a flex, but ultimately this Ravens defense, as I mentioned earlier, doesn't give me any concern whatsoever. Browns, a very different offense ultimately than the Bills, but still, I think Jerry Jeudy, solid start, probably closer to a flex for most of you guys, but you can roll him out there and feel fine. Cedric Tillman, probably out there on the waivers for some of you guys, sitting at 34% rostered. He kind of was a top of the waiver video here in week 2, and I like him a lot in this matchup against the Ravens. I do think he'll be a bit matchup dependent, but we look early in the season here against the Ravens. Packers, not great, but then the Lions, the Vikings, the Steelers, the Dolphins, the Patriots. It's looking pretty good here. As long as Joe Flacco is the quarterback, we should see targets to Cedric Tillman, and I think that he's going to be a solid flex option for the next couple of weeks. Anybody else here, though? Let's just leave him as a sit. Now, Zay Flowers had a big week 1 against a Bills defense that struggled against the wide receiver position and the running back position and the quarterback position. But ultimately, this is really nice to see because Zay Flowers was a very kind of inconsistent player last year. And part of me still worries that we might see some inconsistencies due to the nature of this offense throughout the course of the year and game script and stuff like that. But man, you got to feel good right now if you own Zay Flowers, 28.1 fantasy points, 9 targets, 7 catches, 143 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Ultimately, big day. Still like him here in week 2 against the Cleveland Browns, who definitely on paper right now, and based on what we saw last week, have a better defense than the Bills, but still, you got to feel good if you own Zay Flowers. A solid start. Rashad Bateman, very disappointing in week 1, given the game script and matchup and everything against the Bills. Just 4 targets, 2 receptions, 10 receiving yards, and 3 fantasy points. So got him as a sit. He can still be somebody who maybe based on matchup slides in here at the flex, but for now, we can't call him anything more than a sit. DeAndre Hopkins had the big catch, touchdown catch, 11.5 fantasy points, but outside of that catch, he only had 1 other target. So the volume's still very low here. We take away the touchdown, there would be nothing here. So it will be nice to see moments of DeAndre Hopkins being involved, but until it's like a consistent thing we're seeing week after week, I'm just going to consider him a sit here in week 2. Next up, we have the Bears traveling to face the Lions. I am recording this before Monday Night Football has been played. I apologize. The only way I can do it. If any major injuries happen or anything that really persuades me to feel differently, then it'll be in a pinned comment down below. Don't crucify me in the comments, or you can if you want. But yeah, I think, going into week 2, I'll probably look at DJ Moore as a start, Rome Odunze as a flex. I do like Rome Odunze a lot against the Vikings, so we'll see how things shake out. But these guys are going to be close to the start flex area, I think, no matter what, just based on the nature of this offense and the nature of the matchup against a Lions secondary that still ultimately struggled in week 1 and did not look very good overall. So Monday Night Football will impact things here. I do have Luther Burden as a sit until we see something consistent out of him in his rookie season. And then Olamide Zacchaeus, the other player I guess we could look at or mention potentially by the time you guys are watching this video. But I think ultimately going into week 2, it'll be a toss-up between DJ Moore or Rome Odunze as potential flex startable options. And that's probably where they will be, kind of regardless of how they perform in week 1, because the matchup against the Lions still looks good on paper. Now, the Lions wide receivers you might be kind of freaking out about. Amon-Ra St. Brown, a pretty quiet Sunday with just 8.5 fantasy points. Jameson Williams, also pretty quiet with 6.6 fantasy points. Isaac Tesla did have a very impressive touchdown, but outside of that, he didn't have another single target in this game. Jared Goff was 31 of 39 for 225 passing yards on the day. So, listen, I don't want to freak out here. The Packers played very well at home, have a good defense. Chicago, on paper, I mean, this was a team that didn't allow a ton of fantasy points to wide receivers last year. We'll once again see how Monday Night Football goes. So I just don't want to overreact to week 1 and panic here. I think Amon-Ra St. Brown will still be a startable player week in and week out. Don't forget he had 4.3 fantasy points in week 1 last year. Still finished as a wide receiver 3. Jameson Williams, if you drafted him, you have to expect some risk. He's a high upside flex option that does hold risk on a week-to-week basis. Don't forget, he had 2 weeks last year where he had 1.2 or less fantasy points. There are some ups and downs with Jameson Williams. So point being, it's early. Don't panic. These guys are still viable starts here in week 2. Except we have the Broncos traveling to face the Colts, kicking off the afternoon slate of games for us. Courtland Sutton is just going to be a start every single week for me. The volume is there for him. The red zone targets are there for him. Bo Nix trusts him. Finished that week 1 outing with 9 targets, 6 catches, 61 receiving yards, a touchdown, and 18.1 fantasy points. Gets the Colts this weekend, who, I don't know, maybe the sleeper defense of the year, but like I said earlier, on paper, they actually have a decent defense. So they're on the road here and everything, but yeah, I'm starting Courtland Sutton. He basically sees almost all of the volume in the passing game for this offense at the wide receiver position, but that goes without saying that we did see Troy Franklin have 6 targets and Marvin Mims have 4 targets, but both those guys barely combined for 10 fantasy points. And Pat Bryant had no usage in this game, was only on the field for 5% of snaps. So ultimately, Sutton is the only player we're keeping a close eye on and starting every week in fantasy. And the other guys, Mims, Franklin, keep an eye on, but we're not considering them starts anytime soon. Now, I have Michael Pittman as a sit because unless it's a top 5 superstar or wide receiver, I really don't start wide receivers against Pat Surtain. It's just one of my rules in fantasy. And for the most part, it remains true, right? But Pittman had a huge week 1, to say the least. 20 fantasy points against the Dolphins, 8 targets, 6 catches, 80 receiving yards, and a touchdown. And my kind of thesis for week 1 was Michael Pittman or Josh Downs is going to have a good week 1. I don't know who Danny Dimes necessarily prefers, but whoever he prefers is going to have a good week 1. And it was definitely Pittman, as Josh Downs only had 3 targets, and Alec Pierce also had 3 targets, and both those guys didn't even combine for 10 fantasy points, and A.D. Mitchell just 2 targets, 4 fantasy points. So I think Pittman, I have the asterisk because if you're absolutely desperate, I guess, but I kind of said the same thing about Ridley last week. If you truly have nothing better, I guess the volume's there, but I don't really want you to start Ridley anyways. That's kind of how I feel about Pittman this week. And listen, hand it to Danny Dimes. Great week 1 performance. Let's go Daniel Jones. Let's go Colts fans. But I think the magic could run out here against Denver. Then they get Tennessee in week 3. Then the Rams. This is a tough 3-game stretch looking at how defenses performed in week 1. So I had Pittman as a sit ultimately, and I even have some problem calling him a potential low-end flex if you have absolutely nothing better. So for this matchup, I'm really just looking at Courtland Sutton, and that's going to be it. Next up, we have the Panthers traveling to face the Cardinals. Let's start with T-Mac and company for the Panthers, who were pretty underwhelming due to a very underwhelming week 1 performance from Bryce Young, where he only completed 18 passes off of 35 attempts, threw 2 picks, lost a fumble, and only 154 total passing yards. I still think T-Mac has to be a start. He still came through with 11.8 fantasy points, looked good. 68 total receiving yards off of 5 catches and 9 targets. Definitely the undisputed number 1 option in this offense. So the Cardinals defense, certainly not awful by any stretch, but they still allowed a pretty decent day to Chris Olave in week 1. So if you own T-Mac, solid start. Maybe the upside is limited as long as Bryce Young continues to look like what we thought Bryce Young was before he made strides the end of last season. Xavier Legette, I thought, could have some sneaky potential in this game against the Jags in week 1, but needless to say, that didn't happen. Just 4 fantasy points. So Hunter Renfrow, anybody who's left here, I'm not even considering them anytime soon. It's T-Mac, and that's it until further notice for the Panthers. Marvin Harrison Jr., I felt like was being a little bit undervalued going into week 1, given how bad the Saints defense was last year. And he came through 18.1 fantasy points, 6 targets, 5 catches, 71 receiving yards, and a tutty. He's got to be a start against this Panthers defense here in week 2. Absolute must-start player for me. And anybody else here? Michael Wilson had 1 catch. Greg the Torch Dortch had 1 catch. It's Trey McBride. It's Marvin Harrison Jr. and is James Conner and maybe Trey Benson. And that's it for the nature of this offense. So if you own Marvin Harrison Jr., you should feel good. The volume is there. I know like a little bit of his, total stat line was based on the touchdown, but he scored the touchdown. Who cares? You own Marvin Harrison Jr., I think he's a very strong start, and I think that T-Mac remains a strong start here in week 2. To end the afternoon games, we got a big one between the Eagles and the Chiefs, a very early Super Bowl rematch. I almost feel like this game should be the Sunday night game, but I digress. This is a big matchup when it comes to fantasy because A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith were completely awful in week 1. And I don't know if I want to say awful. They just weren't utilized in the game plan like whatsoever. We saw a combined 4 targets and 4 catches between the 2 superstar wide receivers. But this was just one of those games where the legs of Jalen Hurts and the legs of Saquon Barkley took over. But you do kind of worry because it was a close game. And even though the run game and the quarterback run game were working, you kind of felt like they still need to throw the football throughout this game. Then you look at Jahan Dotson. I mean, he only had 3 targets, 3 catches in the game as well. So, I mean, we're literally looking at 7 total catches between the starting 3 wide receivers. But once again, I'm not going to panic here. What we really want to look at here is the Chiefs were awful against opposing wide receivers in week 1. I mean, I know it was the Brazil game Friday night, kind of weird setting, but Keenan Allen, Ladd McConkey, and Quentin Johnson absolutely ate in week 1. Just don't overreact, okay? If you own A.J. Brown, if you own Devonta Smith, they are still solid starts in week 2. I think ultimately A.J. Brown is a great buy low as well. People are panicking on him. This is a good matchup here in week 2. Should be a good game script. Should be points. Go ahead and start these guys. I'm not going to overreact to week 1. No Xavier Worthy. No Rashee Rice. Hollywood Brown stepped up in big fashion in week 1. At the time of recording this, I know Xavier Worthy is considered week to week. I'm not expecting him to play week 2 against the Eagles. So Hollywood Brown, I think, is a solid start. I was close to putting him as a flex because, it's not the greatest matchup on paper, against the Eagles, but ultimately they still gave up a pretty decent day, to say the least, to CeeDee Lamb in week 1. So Hollywood Brown had 16 targets and 10 catches for 99 receiving yards, 19.9 fantasy points in week 1. I think you got to start him if you own him in week 2. He's a really, and once again, he's probably just going to be a flex option because you either got him off the waiver or drafted him at the end of your draft. So a solid flex option, but very, very startable here in week 2. And Juju Smith-Schuster, maybe an emergency start for some of you guys, as he had 5 targets, 5 catches, and 55 receiving yards, finished with 10.5 fantasy points. But I'm not as confident in starting Juju Smith-Schuster, who does only sit at 2% roster at the time of recording this, but maybe in deeper formats if you're desperate. There's nobody else I want to consider here. Daquan Thornton would be the next man up, and maybe Jalen Royals is good to go week 2. He was out week 1. But for now, start Hollywood, good flex option. Juju, maybe emergency in extreme situations. And don't panic on the Eagles wide receivers. Sunday Night Football, we have the Falcons traveling to face the Vikings. And once again, just remember, I have to record this before Monday Night Football. Don't hate me. If anything happens to the Vikings players or whatever, I'll have it in a comment down below. But let's start with the Falcons. 13.5 fantasy points in week 1 for Drake London. 15 targets, 8 catches, 55 receiving yards. And I feel like I'm crazy or something because I felt like he caught a touchdown, but it was ultimately rolled an incomplete pass. I don't know. I feel like that was a really, really weird situation. But ultimately, no touchdown for Drake London this game. And on that play, he suffered a shoulder injury, and he's considered day-to-day. So we don't know if he's going to play in week 2. And then we got Darnell Mooney dealing with a shoulder injury. He missed week 1. So Ray McLeod was the next man up, who had 8.1 fantasy points. So that left Casey Washington as the next player with the most amount of targets at 6. So I will say I have pretty extreme worry over this Falcons receiving room in week 2, especially because last year the Vikings were pretty good against the run and much softer against the wide receiver position. Once again, we'll see how Monday Night Football goes. But if Drake London plays, I think you still got to start him. It'd be really hard for me to sit a player like London. And I'll just leave it at that. I don't feel good about this wide receiver room. Too many question marks going on right now. Too many shoulder injuries. So I don't really feel too confident starting Mooney if he plays this week. He'll be nothing more than a low-end flex. Maybe he gets some more appeal if London's out, but this is a disaster when it comes to fantasy. So for right now, I'm just going to say London startable if he plays. Outside of that, please, let's just stay away from this situation. Then once again, I am recording this before Monday Night Football, so if anything crazy happens here, it'll be in a comment down below. But I would just consider Justin Jefferson a start. I mean, he could have 1 point in week 1, and I would still consider him a start in week 2. I mean, I guess it's worth noting that A.J. Terrell played pretty well against Mike Evans in week 1, but he still had 5 catches for 51 receiving yards. So, yeah, I mean, come on. It's JJ. We don't need to discuss this. But I will say Adam Thielen, really regardless of how he plays in week 1, as long as he gets enough snap usage here, I think he's a good flex option because I like this matchup against the Falcons here in week 2. They're still very poor against wide receivers in week 1. And I do like him again in week 3. As long as Jordan Addison continues to, serve his suspension, gets the Bengals in week 3. So I think Thielen could be a viable PPR flex option here early in the season. And that'll really do it for this matchup, which is feeling a bit convoluted as long as there's this many shoulder injuries going around for the Falcons. All right, we've got 2 Monday Night Football games. Let's start with the Buccaneers traveling to face the Texans. 2 offenses that felt somewhat disappointing in week 1. I mean, I feel like the Buccaneers still felt disappointing, although they played pretty well. I felt like there should have been a little bit more. I guess it was good enough, but the Texans definitely felt disappointing, right? But like I just said in the last matchup, Mike Evans had 10 fantasy points. You still got to start him on a week-to-week basis. Derek Stingley got a little bit banged up in week 1. That really hurt the Texans. Ultimately, Mike Evans is going to be a guy you start every single week. Emeka Egbuka was on our Players That Will Go Nuclear video. Ended up being a good call. It was a great matchup for him. And this is like the value of Emeka Egbuka. Mike Evans is on the field. You got to worry about Mike Evans on every single snap, right? And that just opens up so much for Emeka Egbuka. And imagine when Chris Godwin is on the field as well. So Egbuka, big day, 6 targets, 4 catches, 67 receiving yards, 2 tutties, and 23.6 fantasy points, and ended up having, what was the game-winning score for the Bucs. So big day, like him a lot in week 2. Very, very strong start. Last week we had him as a start, not a flex, but a start. He's going to be a start until further notice. Don't really need to talk about anybody else here on this roster. Nico Collins, disappointing in week 1 to say the least. 5.5 fantasy points, 5 targets, 3 catches, 25 receiving yards, but that Rams defense looks really good right now across the board. The Bucs defense didn't look awful necessarily in week 1. I will still say it's a stronger matchup here in week 2. And ultimately, I'm just not going to panic on Nico Collins. This is still a star player that I think you ultimately have to start in week 2. Jaden Higgins, Jalen Noel, Xavier Hutchinson, nobody was really able to step up with the absence of Christian Kirk and with Nico Collins not doing much. But I mean, this offensive line for the Texans, which we all expected to be bad, I mean, it looks god awful. And CJ Stroud looked god-awful in this game as well. So there are concerns here, but I'm still going to call Nico Collins a start. What's more disappointing, I think, is like the fact that there's no true number 2 wide receiver stepping up in terms of fantasy production here. But Collins got to be a start. Evans and Nick Buka feel very good if you own those 2 guys, or one of those 2 guys, I should say. Last but not least, we have the Chargers traveling to face the Raiders, and we've got the best wide receiver room in the NFL with the Chargers. Ladd McConkey, 13.4 fantasy points in week 1. Keenan Allen at 19.8 fantasy points in. Quentin Johnston, 24.9 fantasy points. Absolutely shredded the Chiefs secondary. Justin Herbert had himself a day, throwing for 318 passing yards and 3 tutties. I'm going to go ahead and call Ladd McConkey a start still. I know some Ladd McConkey owners a little shaky, I guess, because he didn't score a touchdown or whatever, but he'll be fine. Still ran an intense amount of routes, looked very good, had a great win percentage on his routes, and Ladd is still that guy. You got to start him. Keenan Allen, I mean, originally I had him just as a flex. I think it's just a start for me, though. But I was really high on Keenan Allen in the offseason, and, you know, this was kind of validation, right? But, I mean, he had 10 targets in this game. He had the most targets of any wide receiver on this offense. So, Keenan Allen in a good matchup against the Raiders. Solid start this week. Probably just going to be a flex for a lot of you guys. But, yeah, solid start. And I got Quentin Johnston as a sit. I was close to putting him as a flex. We've been down this road with Quentin Johnston before, right? And, I mean, on the channel, like, I've been a little bit more supportive of Quentin Johnston than a lot of people out there. And even in the offseason, I was saying, like, you know, I don't think he's dead in the water. He still had over 700 receiving yards and 8 touchdowns last year and was a top 40 fantasy wide receiver. Just we had some writing on the wall with 2 rookie wide receivers and Trey Harris and Keandre Lambert-Smith. But Johnston, worth picking up, worth rostering, maybe flexible if you are absolutely desperate because the matchup is good this week. But let's see some consistency here before we get too carried away. And that's the problem with Quentin Johnston is you'll have these big spike weeks and they don't always stick for a long period of time. Not saying he doesn't have fantasy value or production, but ultimately I would be a little worried if I really had to start him in week 2. Ladd and Keenan Allen, though, good starts. We got the Raiders. Really like Jacoby Myers when all things were said and done going into week 1 with no Christian Gonzalez. For the Patriots, he came through 17.7 fantasy points, 10 targets, 8 catches, and 97 receiving yards. And ultimately, this is a good matchup. The Chargers, you know, were allowed a lot of fantasy points to Hollywood Brown and company, like we just talked about a few moments ago. So Jacoby Myers, I think a solid start here in week 2. Feel really good if I own him. He is kind of the undisputed pass catching option at the wide receiver position in this offense. We saw 3 targets to Trey Tucker, 4 targets to Dante Thornton, and Jack Besh came out of the grave with 1 target and 1 catch as well. And Brock Bowers obviously, you know, still in the picture here, but he is dealing with that knee injury. He had 8 targets in week 1, and Michael Mayer came out with 4 targets as well at the tight end position. But Mayer saw the most volume, undisputedly here. Good matchup against the Chargers in week 2. He's going to be a solid start for you guys. Everybody else here worth keeping an eye on, and I'm still crossing my fingers for a Dante Thornton breakout game, but for right now, they just got to be sits as we get ready for week 2. There you guys have it. Every single matchup, every single wide receiver as we approach week 2 of the fantasy season. If you guys have any fantasy football questions whatsoever, drop them in the comments down below. I will answer every single question on this video. Whatever you guys need to help you guys get through week 2 of the fantasy season, I am here for you guys. While you're down there, do me a big favor. Hit that subscribe button on the way out. This is all we do here all year long. Free fantasy football content, redraft, dynasty, and best ball. If you guys are into that, be sure to subscribe on the way out. It really helps me a lot. And when the playlists do pop up on the screen, we're going to have everything as the week progresses that you guys will possibly need for week 2 of the fantasy season. Go check out some of the other videos. Hope you guys get prepared for the upcoming week. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.